Okay, chapter 7 is all about photosynthesis, and the chapter begins by defining a couple of important terms, the photoautotrophs and heterotrophs. The photoautotrophs are the plants and algae, and these are called the primary producers because they produce carbohydrates using CO2 gas and energy from sunlight. And this production of carbohydrates, or building of carbohydrates from CO2 gas, is referred to as carbon fixation. So this is an endergonic process. Recall from chapter 5 that there's endergonic and exergonic reactions. Endergonic reaction requires an input of energy. So that energy is coming from sunlight in this case. The heterotrophs are consuming the primary producers, so eating plants, and obviously this would be the animals, but also when plant and algae die, then the bacteria and fungi break down the plant material and use the carbohydrates as a source of energy. So animals, plants, animals, fungi, and many bacteria are heterotrophs. And these heterotrophs are completely dependent on the producers. If the producers were to disappear, then so would the heterotrophs, including ourselves. So here we have the overall process of photosynthesis, and this is the overall equation. So we have CO2 gas, water, and energy as the reactants, and glucose and oxygen as the products. So the overall process is shown here, and photosynthesis is basically a two-step process. And these two steps are called the light reactions and the dark reactions. The light reactions are occurring in the thylakoid membranes of the chloroplast. So the chloroplast has two compartments, thylakoids and the stroma. The thylakoids are these stacked membranes, and the stroma is the aqueous environment, so it's everything outside of the thylakoid membranes. So in the first step, the light reactions, sunlight is absorbed by pigments in the thylakoid membrane, and the energy from the sunlight is used to form ATP. So we have ADP and inorganic phosphate forming ATP. Also, in the light reactions, water is oxidized. So electrons are removed from water and they're added to a cofactor called NADP+. So when the electrons are added to NADP+, that forms NADPH. Also, when water is oxidized, what remains after you remove the electrons from the water is oxygen gas. So this is where the oxygen we breathe comes from, is from this process of oxidizing water. And in the second step, the CO2 gas from the atmosphere is reduced. So now electrons are added to the CO2 gas. And when you add the electrons to the CO2 gas, ultimately you form glucose, sugar. So this is how the plant generates sugar, by reducing CO2 gas from the atmosphere. That process is called the Calvin cycle, and it requires energy. And that energy comes in the form of ATP. So the ATP produced in the light reactions is then used in the Calvin cycle to make this process happen. And next we'll look at the details of these two steps. Now let's take a look at the light reactions in more detail. So the light reactions are taking place in the thylakoid, and the thylakoid membrane has a number of proteins in it. These membrane proteins, and the first one involved is called photosystem 2. And photosystem 2 has chlorophyll pigments associated with it. And these chlorophyll pigments, when sunlight hits them, the chlorophyll pigments transfer the energy in the sunlight to electrons that get taken from water. So the photosystem 2 oxidizes water, removes the electrons, and the energy from the chlorophylls excite the electrons, and they get excited to a higher energy level. When the water gets oxidized, what remains is oxygen and hydrogen ion. And next, the electrons get transferred to a series of proteins called the electron transport chain. So these electrons are transferred to these proteins, and as they are transferred to these proteins can utilize the energy in the electron and convert it to using that energy to pump hydrogen ions across the thylakoid membrane from the stroma that's outside of the thylakoid to the inside of the thylakoid. The interior of the thylakoid is called the thylakoid space. So these hydrogen ions get pumped in here and they build up inside the thylakoid space. And the electron, when it loses the energy, it then goes to photosystem 1. This is another protein in the membrane. It also has chlorophyll pigments. And so these chlorophyll pigments absorb sunlight again and transfer the energy to the electron. The electron gets excited and to a higher energy level, and then gets added to the cofactor NADP+. And so when the electron is added to NADP+, becomes NADPH. Meanwhile, the hydrogen ions that have built up in the thylakoid space diffuse out again through a channel called the ATP synthase. And this is another protein channel in the membrane. And when these hydrogen ions flow down their concentration gradient out of the thylakoid space, their potential energy is extracted and used to form ATP. So that energy, you can think of it as like water flowing down a dam, a hydroelectric dam. It's the same concept. You're taking the potential energy and using it to generate electricity, but in this case, the gradient of these hydrogen ions is used to make ATP. So ADP and inorganic phosphate are combined to form ATP, and this is called chemiosmosis, where the hydrogen ions flow down their concentration gradient to form ATP. We saw this before in chapter 6. This also takes place in the mitochondrion, but here it's being used also in the chloroplast. So at the end of the light reactions, we have ATP being formed, and we have reduced cofactor NADPH. And next we'll see how those are used in the Calvin cycle. Okay, next we look at the Calvin cycle in more detail. So the Calvin cycle is taking CO2 gas from the atmosphere and adding it to a 5-carbon compound called ribulose bisphosphate. So of course the CO2 gas is 1 carbon. You're adding that to a 5-carbon compound, and that forms a 6-carbon compound. But that 6-carbon compound is unstable, and it quickly breaks down into 2 3-carbon compounds. And the 3-carbon compounds are called 3-phosphoglycerate. The 3-phosphoglycerate is then reduced to form glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. And that's done by the reduced cofactor from the light reactions, the NADPH. And this also requires energy, so ATP is required for this. And so ATP is hydrolyzed, and that energy from ATP is what drives this to take place. And the glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, if you combine 2 of those, you get glucose. And then the rest of the cycle is simply to regenerate the ribulose bisphosphate, and that requires energy in the form of ATP. You may wonder, well, how do you get the carbon to regenerate this if you're using it all up to make glucose? Well, it takes several turns of this cycle to regenerate the ribulose bisphosphate. And actually it takes, what's actually occurring is 5 of the glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate are combining to form 3 ribulose bisphosphates, so 15 carbons. But the stoichiometry is not that important. What's important is, though, that you understand the overall concept here, that this Calvin cycle, the input is CO2 gas, the output is glucose. And that requires 2 things. It requires energy in the form of ATP, and it requires electrons from NADPH. Okay, finally, in Chapter 7, we have the principle of photorespiration. So photorespiration is an adaptation by certain plants. Well, the photorespiration is a problem that plants have, and then there are certain plants that are adapted to deal with it. So the photorespiration occurs in hot, dry conditions. So plants in a hot, dry condition have to close their stomata. The stomata are little pores in the leaf, and that let the gases exchange. So the stomata let the CO2 get in and the oxygen get out. But in a hot, dry condition, those stomata are closed down to prevent water from escaping the plant and causing the plant to dry out. So with the stomata closed, the CO2 can't get in and the oxygen can't get out. And so that creates a problem, because the buildup of the oxygen inside the plant will inhibit the rubisco enzyme. And rubisco is the enzyme that adds the CO2 to the ribulose bisphosphate. So when that enzyme gets inhibited, you can't do photosynthesis. So certain plants have evolved a way to deal with that or adapt to that, and those are called the C4 and CAM plants. C4 plants produce a compound that is a C4 compound that is a way to store CO2. It adds CO2 to a C3 compound, making a C4 compound, and then it stores that in specialized cells called the bundle sheath cells. The CAM plants do all of that, but they also close down their stomata during the day, but then open their stomata at night when it's cooler. And in that way they're able to exchange gases at night